Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. It's the start of the FIDE Grand Prix series. 3 tournaments, and at the end of it, the top 2 players will qualify for the Candidates Tournament. So that is the big prize at the end of it. There's a group of players, and each player will play in just 2 of these 3 tournaments. This first one has just started in Berlin. Let me see. If you want to check out the full rules, then do Google it. It's quite complex, but basically in each tournament there are 4 groups of 4 players. The top player in each of those group of 4 will go on to play a semi-final and then a final, and well, do check out the rules. Anyway, I want to show you this game. It's a brilliant strategic struggle. Absolutely fascinating. At the end, there is such an evil trap, so stick around. This is really good stuff. So Radoslaw Wojtaszek from Poland, very experienced, very classy player, classical player, long-time second of Vichy Anand in his World Championship matches, very cultured player. Quite a clash of styles. He's playing against Richard Rapport, who we know is, on the up at the moment, had a good Tata Steel tournament, edging into the top 10 in the world. Okay, let's see what happened. Wojtaszek plays d4. He's a solid d4 player. This is a kind of Bogo Indian, but actually very quickly we transpose into a Catalan, the opening of the moment. So there we go. Now we're basically in a Catalan. In fact, this is the same as Carlsen Mamadjarov from Tata Steel 2022, and Carlsen castled here. But Wojtaszek played Queen c2. This is interesting because this is exactly the same as the game, brilliant game, Anand against Topalov from their World Championship match in 2010, where Wojtaszek was Anand's second. So, he knows his stuff. does Radek. So Queen c2, of course, a very normal Catalan move. Looks to pick up this pawn, but also looks down this diagonal. It's on an excellent square. So Toppy played bishop takes bishop check in that position. But c5 from Rapport, so he's breaking down the centre straight away. And this is a temporary pawn sacrifice by Wojtaszek. So at the moment black is a pawn up, that is the extra pawn. However, white's pieces are superbly placed here, and it's not going to be difficult for white to gather up this pawn. And this is such a typical Catalan position where the C and D files are going to clear. And the real problem for black in this position is how do you bring this piece into the game? Particularly when there's that superb bishop raking across the board. Bishop d7, rook here looks very passive. White's going to take here. The bishop isn't on a great square. And here, Rapport, typically finds a very creative way to bring this bishop into the game. He plays rook a6. Now we saw something like this from Mamadjarov, a rather different position where Mamadjarov tried to hang on to his extra pawn. But this is all about bringing the rook off the long diagonal, and then he's going to be able to bring this bishop here. So rook d1 covers the pawn, or prepares to take the pawn. b5, here's the point. So the knight moves to e5, and now bishop b7, and black has solved the problem of how to bring that bishop into the game, and it's on the long diagonal. If queen takes pawn, then rook b6, and black gets enough play there. But Wojtaszek plays in a very clean way. He exchanges and takes on d4. And if the queens are exchanged, then this is certainly more comfortable for white. You can see white is just better coordinated. These rooks are split. That's not so good. And the queenside pawns could be vulnerable. a very typical Catalan position. You know, you used to see this thing in the 1970s when Karpov and Anderson were grinding away in these kind of positions. It's a very different way of playing. Well, I mean, Carlsen does this too sometimes, but you know, if we think how Carlsen has been playing the Catalan in the Tata Steel tournament, where he got these very sharp positions. But this is kind of the old way of playing for white. So instead of exchanging off into the endgame, Queen A8, supporting that bishop on the long diagonal. Rook C1, beautiful coordination. Connected rooks compared with the split rooks. That's not so good. If black were coordinated here, if the rook were, say, on C8, I think black would be able to equalise quite easily. But this little shuffle to bring the bishop to the long diagonal has created just a little bit of disharmony. H6, played by Rapport. Of course, it's useful to give the king an escape square on H7. Now, have a think how you would play in this position. This is the first move, which is superb by Wojtaszek. You know, one might think, let's just solve the problem and sort this bishop, or get rid of that bishop. But now black coordinates, and actually black is pretty close to equality there. It's not bad. Instead of that, Wojtaszek realised that he could play for the advantage. Bishop F1. And we've seen something similar like this before. Basically, you put the bishop back and you're prepared to play the bishop into E5. The knight into E5 to attack the bishop and try to, create a target. Basically, that bishop is a target. It's so interesting. And there's a little tactical point, a beautiful little tactical point. If bishop takes knight, queen takes pawn, yeah, it's possible to play bishop takes pawn. That still looks pleasant for white, but a really evil move is A4. So pinning here, and then pawn takes pawn, and that is a big pass pawn on B5. Bishop F1, absolutely brilliant. Very easy move to overlook for both sides actually, but well spotted. So bishop D5, preempting knight E5, which was played. Queen B8, and here is the point. Now F3, and in fact, that bishop isn't really secure on D5 because E4 is coming. And notice how, white's pieces are so well coordinated, they can't be shifted. So it's hard for black to counter this plan. Rook D6, and such a tricky move by Rapport. He's trying to coordinate his pieces, and it looks like E4 should be winning with this pin. Pin and win. But in this position, beautiful move. Rook D8. Now the rook is protected, so the bishop threatens to move away. And if pawn takes bishop, rook takes, hits the queen, hits the knight, and black wins the piece back. So a nice little trap there to coordinate the pieces. Very beautiful move. So after rook d6, well, Wojtaszek avoided that with queen c5. It was a bit too transparent. Nevertheless, very creative. Rook d6. Queen c5, good move. And now if rook d8, then queen c7. Yeah, exchanging queens, and then you can play e4, and this is actually very nice in combination with the knight. And this pawn is vulnerable. Watch out for that. That's the other thing about this bishop on f1. So queen c5 just played. Rook a6. The rook comes back. Queen c7 anyway. The endgames are certainly favourable for white. Exchange and e4. An important move so that neither bishop or knight actually can use the d5 square. Again, a creative defence from Rapport coming. Of course, one could exchange here. White is very comfortable. That knight on f6 is out of play. There's rook c7 potentially coming. Those pawns are a little bit vulnerable. Don't forget moves like rook c5. You know, white can build up very steadily, king to e3. Very nice position for white. Classic Catalan endgame. So Rapport instead plays rook b6. So he's prepared to give up a pawn in order to target this pawn here. Now at first, Wojtaszek is having none of it. He just builds up slowly. You know, he's comfortable with black exchanging here. g5, again an attempt to unsettle white with perhaps this pawn sacrifice. So g4, king g7, and finally Wojtaszek decides take the pawn, and the rook comes to b3. So just for the moment it's not so easy for white. You don't want to take here and allow rook takes. So that knight can't move for the moment, but actually Wojtaszek has it under control. King f2 defends the pawn, a4, rook c2. So now that both rooks defend the b pawn, the knight can move. So this is, you know, the technical phase of the game. Can white convert this extra pawn? Rapport trying for counterplay with rook h8, knight e5. Rook back, knight d3. Now that's a great square because defends the pawn, but the rook now has freedom. So it's just a nice little shuffling. The rook check actually doesn't achieve that much. The king is safe. The rook can't do very much on its own. Rook takes, knight d7. So this knight is the problem. It needs to come into play. King e2, but you know, Wojtaszek has certainly made progress over the last few moves. He's relieved the pressure on this pawn. The knight is looking good, looking at some key squares in the position here. King f6, rook c2, rook b8, rook c4. Yeah, this is a problem. Well, you know, if black defends passively, then one feels that white should be able to wrap things up. So knight e5. So now it starts getting a little bit tricky. Rapport has prepared a really nice idea here. So if knight takes, then okay, this is the obvious one. Then check here and check that the king comes in, and black is obviously fine. So rook b4. Rook takes rook. Now this is the evil trap, because the obvious move here is to play pawn takes rook. Let's have a look at this one. Pawn takes, pass pawn. The king can come over. The king and pawn ending is obviously winning for white with the extra pawn. It looks like the knight is going to have to retreat. The king comes over to support this. This pawn is even vulnerable as well. But Rapport had seen a brilliant idea here. This is why he went for it. Knight c4. I should just mention this did not happen. Wojtaszek spotted this. Knight c4. What's the big deal? Well, this is the big deal. When the king comes over, knight takes pawn and a3. And suddenly, black is winning. King c2, a2, and the pawn goes home. It's a well-known endgame tactic, but, well, many players have overlooked it. Now, after knight c4, white can still draw this position. I mean, you can do something like this. It's going to be a draw, but nothing more than that after knight c4. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Brilliant idea. Wojtaszek spotted it and played knight takes. Knight c4 and now just knight d3. So Wojtaszek is still a sound pawn to the good, and now it's a case of bringing the king over. Maybe a better try for black is to just exchange a lot of pawns here. That would require more care from white. But the king came over, and now simple move, king d4. So the knight wants to come in here, and this is winning. f6 tries to stop that. e5 breaks things open anyway. f5. Now this involves some calculation. It gets just a little bit tricky, but white just has to find a couple of nice moves. So e7 threatens to make a queen. Knight d6 stops that. King d5 threatening king takes knight. If pawn here, then of course the queen comes with check, so white wins. So knight back, and here's a good move, f4. So that keeps the pawns on the board. This pawn can be controlled, but this pawn is now a target. Better than playing f4 is better than exchanging pawns. Now again, a couple of delicate moves. Basically white is winning this. So first of all, before plunging in with the king, this knight prevents the king moving to c4, and of course still controls the g-pawn. So black is just passive now. And now Wojtaszek made a queen and Rapport resigned. Okay, let's just have a quick look why he resigned. If knight takes, king takes, and actually the king cannot move in. If king to here, then knight takes f5, check, and then you take the pawn. So basically, in this position, the king is completely stymied. You can give up the pawn, but I mean this is a very easy win. So for example here, and you just give up the knight and king takes and the pawn rolls home. Wow, I mean this was so delicately played by Wojtaszek, and he tactically had to be very switched on. So star moves here, bishop f1, brilliant, absolutely brilliant move, and that allowed the knight to come to e5. And then later on, you know, tactically you've got to be so aware and to recognize that a takes and knight c4 is actually drawing the game for black. Brilliant. So good start for Radoslaw Wojtaszek. Richard Rapport, bit of a surprise. Maybe he's tired after Tartar Steel, but he will have to fight to come back to try to win the group. I'll be dipping in and out of the tournament over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, really strong players. It should be really interesting to see what happens. See you soon.